The night was calm in Los Angeles, the kind of evening where the city's usual noise seemed to soften under the glow of streetlights. Inside a modest charity gala, laughter and conversation filled the hall. Celebrities, producers, and guests mingled easily, some catching up with old friends, others trying to make new connections. It was one of those nights that didn't feel rushed or loud, but quietly meaningful. Keanu Reeves had come as he often did, without any grand entrance or camera crew following him. He didn't care for attention. He wore a simple black suit, his hair brushed back casually and a look in his eyes that showed both calm and depth. He smiled politely as people greeted him, but he mostly kept to himself, standing near the edge of the crowd with a glass of water in his hand. Across the room, Mel Gibson was talking with a few friends from the film industry. Despite his fame and past controversies, he seemed relaxed tonight, more grounded. He had been focusing on smaller projects lately and spending more time with family. When someone told him Keanu was there, Mel smiled and nodded. "I'd like to say hi to him," he said. A few minutes later, the two men met near a quiet corner of the room, away from the noise of the crowd. There was a handshake, a few friendly words, and then they both laughed softly as if they'd known each other much longer than they actually had. "Good to see you again," Mel said, taking a sip of his drink. "You too," Keanu replied, his voice calm and thoughtful as always. "It's been a while." They spoke at first about simple things, recent film projects, the event they were attending, the people they both knew. But it didn't take long for their conversation to drift into deeper territory, the kind that happens naturally when two people who've seen both success and pain start to reflect on life. "I've been thinking a lot about purpose lately," Mel said, looking down at his glass. "All this, the work, the money, the attention. Sometimes it feels hollow, you know." Keanu nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think a lot of people feel that way. You reach certain milestones and you realize they don't fill you the way you thought they would." There was a brief pause between them. The crowd in the background continued to talk and laugh, but their little corner of the room felt peaceful, as if time had slowed. Mel watched Keanu for a moment. There was something different about him, something grounded, not detached but calm in a way that made you feel safe talking to him. "Do you ever think about faith?" Mel asked. "About what it means, beyond religion, I mean." Keanu looked thoughtful. He didn't answer right away. He was careful with his words, as if he wanted to make sure he spoke from the heart, not just from habit. "I do," he finally said. "A lot, actually. I didn't always talk about it, but I've thought about it for years. You go through things in life, loss, pain, confusion, and after a while you start searching for something that feels real. Something that doesn't change when everything else does." Mel nodded. "I know what you mean." Keanu's eyes softened. "When I was younger, I didn't have all the answers. I still don't. But I've come to understand that love, real love, the kind that forgives and gives without expecting anything, it's not something humans created. It's something given to us, something divine." Mel leaned back slightly, surprised by the simplicity and honesty of Keanu's words. "That's a beautiful way to see it." Keanu smiled faintly. "It's taken me a long time to get there. You know, I've lost people I loved deeply. My best friend, my partner, my daughter. It changes you. You can let the pain make you bitter, or you can let it open your eyes." Mel's expression grew heavy. "I've made mistakes too," he said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like faith was the only thing that got me through, but I still struggle with guilt, with feeling unworthy." Keanu's voice was gentle. "You're not alone in that. Everyone struggles with it. I think that's why the message of Jesus means so much to me. It's not about being perfect, and it's about being forgiven. It's about understanding that love and grace are stronger than guilt." Mel looked down, his hands folded. "You really believe that?" "I do," Keanu said without hesitation. "Not because someone told me to, but because I've seen it in my life. When I was lost, when I was broken, I felt this quiet peace that I can't explain. It wasn't from me. It was something higher. I believe it was him." There was a stillness in the air now. Mel's eyes glistened slightly. The noise of the room seemed to fade completely. The two men sat there, two actors who had lived very public lives, yet in that moment they were just two human beings talking about hope. "I used to think religion was about rules," Keanu continued, "but now I think it's about relationship. It's about knowing that no matter how far you've fallen, there's a hand reaching out to you. You just have to take it. Mel nodded slowly, visibly moved. You know, hearing you say that, it reminds me why I made The Passion of the Christ years ago. People thought it was just a film, but to me it was more than that. It was about trying to show that same love and that sacrifice. Keanu looked at him with quiet respect. And you did. That film touched a lot of hearts, even mine. Mel smiled faintly, but his voice trembled slightly. Funny thing is, even after making it, I still found myself doubting. It's like I could show faith to others, but I couldn't always feel it for myself. That's the hard part, Keanu said softly. We can talk about faith, but feeling it, that takes time. Sometimes it comes in silence, in small ways. A stranger's kindness, a quiet sunrise, a moment of peace you didn't expect. That's when I feel closest to God. The words hung in the air for a while. Mel didn't speak. He just nodded, almost whispering a prayer under his breath. There was something deeply healing about hearing those words. Not from a priest, not from a preacher, but from a man who had walked through fire and still found light. After a few minutes, Keanu smiled again. You know what I've realized, he said. Faith doesn't mean everything gets easy. It just means you don't walk alone anymore. Mel looked up at him, his eyes slightly wet. That's true, he said softly. I needed to hear that. They both sat in silence again, not out of awkwardness, but out of shared understanding. Around them, people were still talking, laughing, taking photos. But for those few minutes, that small corner of the room felt sacred, not because of who they were, but because of what was being said. Finally, Mel spoke again. You've got a good heart, Keanu. Not many people in this business talk like that. Keanu shook his head gently. I'm just trying to be honest. The world's full of noise. Sometimes the truth gets lost in it. Mel smiled faintly. Yeah, but it's good to know there are still people who care about something deeper. Keanu looked thoughtful again. You know, I don't think faith is about convincing others. I think it's about living in a way that reminds people what love looks like. That's all. Those words seemed to stay with Mel long after that night. He felt something stir inside him, a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about religion or reputation anymore. It was about the simple truth that love could still reach him, even after all the mistakes, even after all the noise. As the event came to an end, they stood and shook hands again. There was no dramatic farewell, no emotional goodbye, just a quiet nod between two men who had shared something real. Take care of yourself, Keanu said with a warm smile. You too, Mel replied. They walked their separate ways into the cool Los Angeles night. But something about that conversation stayed with both of them. Keanu, as he drove home through the city lights, felt grateful, not for fame or success, but for the quiet moments where real connection still existed. And Mel, sitting alone in his car later, wiped away a tear he hadn't expected to fall. It wasn't sadness. It was something else. It was peace. That night, neither of them knew how much their quiet talk would mean to others once the story spread. But for them, it wasn't about that. It was about truth and faith and the simple grace that comes when two souls find understanding in the middle of a noisy world. The days that followed the gala were quiet for both Keanu and Mel, though not in the way one might think. The conversation they'd shared that night lingered in both of their minds like a soft echo. Neither man spoke of it to others. It wasn't the kind of discussion that needed public attention. But it had left an impression, something deeper than what words could fully express. Keanu, in his usual reflective way, often found himself thinking about that night. He had always been someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Despite his fame, he never sought to be in the limelight unless it was for the work itself. But that moment of vulnerability with Mel had felt different. It wasn't about fame or reputation. It was about a shared understanding of something larger, something beyond them. As he sat in his favorite little cafe, a quiet spot he'd frequented for years, Keanu sipped his coffee and let the sounds of the city hum around him. He was in his own world, thinking about the many ways life could surprise you, and how sometimes the most meaningful moments didn't come with applause or recognition. They came in moments of real connection, where two people found common ground in the things that mattered most. Mel, on the other hand, had found himself replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. He had always been a man of deep faith, especially after making The Passion of the Christ. But hearing Keanu's perspective, hearing the quiet strength in his words, had given him a new sense of clarity. There was something so peaceful, so effortless in Keanu's belief that made Mel question his own doubts. Maybe faith didn't need to be so complicated. Maybe it was about letting go, about trusting something greater than himself. That afternoon, Mel sat in his office looking at a stack of papers that needed attention, but his mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Keanu. It wasn't just what Keanu had said, it was the way he had said it. There had been no pressure, no need to prove anything, just honesty, and the kind of truth that could only come from someone who had truly lived through hardship and emerged with a quiet, unshakable faith. He remembered the words clearly. It's not about being perfect. It's about being forgiven. Mel had spent so many years feeling weighed down by mistakes, by regrets, by the expectations of others. It was hard for him to let go of the idea that he had to prove himself, that he had to justify his past, to make up for the things he had done wrong. But what Keanu had said made him wonder if it was time to finally let go of that burden. Mel leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the view of the city below. It was a beautiful, peaceful sight, the kind of scene that made him feel small yet somehow connected to something much bigger than himself. He thought about all the years he had spent trying to control everything around him, trying to shape his life and career into something that would silence the critics and the voices of doubt. But what if it wasn't about control at all? What if faith in its simplest form was about surrender, about trusting that there was something in this world, something beyond human understanding that could help guide him through the toughest times? That evening, Mel called a close friend of his, someone who had known him through the ups and downs of his career. They hadn't spoken in a while, but he needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand without judgment. After the usual greetings, Mel's voice grew quieter as he spoke. I've been thinking a lot about what Keanu said the other night, Mel began. I don't know why, but it stuck with me. He said something that just clicked. He said faith isn't about perfection. It's about forgiveness. His friend, a man who had seen the complexities of Mel's life firsthand, was silent for a moment before responding. That's true. Mel, you've spent years carrying around a lot of guilt, but you're only human like the rest of us. You can't carry all that weight forever. You've got to let go at some point. Mel exhaled slowly, the weight of his own thoughts pressing on his chest. I don't know how to let go. I've tried, but it's like the guilt just won't leave. It's like I'm stuck in this cycle of regret and I can't move forward. You know, Mel, sometimes we don't have to have all the answers, his friend said. Faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trust. Trusting that things can change, that you don't have to carry everything alone. Maybe it's time to give yourself some grace. Mel sat in silence, absorbing the words. They weren't new, but hearing them again, especially after the conversation with Keanu, felt different. He had spent so many years battling with his own sense of worth, trying to make up for mistakes that no amount of work could erase. But maybe it wasn't about erasing them. Maybe it was about learning to accept them and move forward. As the days passed, Mel found himself revisiting the things Keanu had said, reflecting on them more deeply. He didn't immediately feel a shift, but something was starting to change. He had always believed in God, but now he wondered if his faith needed a different kind of approach. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect or constantly striving to do more. Maybe it was about being present, accepting where he was, and knowing that God's grace didn't come from being flawless. It came from being open. One morning, Mel found himself standing in his living room, looking out the window. The sun had just risen, casting a soft light over the city below. He closed his eyes for a moment and, without fully understanding why, whispered a prayer to himself. God, help me let go of the past. Help me trust that I can be more than my mistakes. Help me understand that faith is about accepting grace for myself and for others. The words felt simple, but they also felt real. For the first time in a long while, Mel didn't feel like he was fighting against something. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was just being, and that in itself felt like a small victory. Across town, Keanu had found himself reflecting on the same themes. His life, in many ways, had been a series of quiet lessons. He had learned that life didn't always follow a clear path. Sometimes it was messy, sometimes it was painful, but there were always moments of peace hidden within the chaos. And those moments, those quiet revelations, had taught him to embrace faith in a way that felt natural. Keanu wasn't someone who believed in forced change or grand gestures. He didn't believe in converting people through speeches. Instead, he believed in showing up for people, being kind and living a life that reflected the things he believed in. That was the true power of faith. It wasn't in the words you said, but in the life you lived. One afternoon, Keanu sat on a park bench, looking out at the people passing by. He thought about the way people so often ran through life, chasing after things they thought they needed. Success, recognition, possessions, they were all distractions from what really mattered. He had seen it in his own life, and in the lives of those around him. People worked so hard to prove themselves, to earn their worth, but they often forgot that they were already enough. In that moment, Keanu felt a sense of calm wash over him. He didn't need to explain everything to anyone. He didn't need to convince anyone of what he believed. All he had to do was live with love, with kindness, and with faith that things would work out in the end. As time passed, Keanu and Mel found themselves drawn back into their routines. The world around them continued with its usual pace: film sets, meetings, interviews, and the occasional public appearance. But for both men, the conversation they had shared in that quiet corner of the charity event still lingered in their minds. It wasn't that they had suddenly become different people, but something inside them had shifted, even if it was subtle. Life felt a little more grounded, a little more centered. Keanu, true to his nature, didn't talk much about the moments of reflection he had experienced after the conversation. He wasn't the type to seek validation or approval from others. Instead, he chose to live in a way that reflected the quiet revelations he'd come to. He began to see the small acts of kindness, the simple moments of peace, as reflections of something greater than himself. One evening, after finishing a long day of filming, Keanu took a walk through the quiet streets near his home. The air was cool, the city lights flickered in the distance, and the noise of the busy day had finally quieted. It was in these moments that Keanu often felt most alive, surrounded by the stillness and the simplicity of life. His mind wandered back to that night with Mel. He thought about the doubts Mel had shared, the way he had expressed feeling unworthy despite his achievements and his faith. Keanu knew the feeling all too well. There were times when he questioned whether he was enough to give, enough to change the world, enough to offer others a sense of hope. But what had struck him so deeply in Mel's words was the truth that no one ever felt fully enough in every moment. We all struggle, we all have doubts, and that was okay. It was part of being human. As he walked, Keanu passed by a small cafe, one that he had often visited over the years. He paused for a moment, feeling the urge to step inside. The warm light spilling from the windows seemed inviting, and the familiar smell of coffee and pastries was comforting. Inside, the cafe was nearly empty, with just a couple of people quietly sipping their drinks and reading their books. Keanu ordered his usual, a simple black coffee, and sat by the window, looking out at the dimming world outside. He took a sip of his drink and closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying the warmth that spread through him. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt perfectly right, as though he were exactly where he was meant to be. But it wasn't just the moment itself that made it special. It was the feeling of connection to something bigger, something beyond the everyday chaos of life. It was the sense that even in the midst of all the noise and distractions, there was peace to be found. He had come to realize that peace wasn't something you could chase or force. It was something that arrived when you stopped looking for it and simply allowed it to be. Meanwhile, across town, Mel had spent the past few days reflecting on the conversation he had with Keanu. Something about the simplicity of Keanu's faith, the quiet confidence in his belief, had struck a chord deep within him. Mel had always believed in God, but over the years, he had struggled with the complexities of faith, the pressures of living up to an ideal, the need to reconcile his flaws and mistakes with the teachings he held dear. But Keanu had made him see that faith wasn't about perfection. It was about trust. It was about knowing that even when things didn't make sense, or when life felt overwhelming, there was still a greater force at work. It was about surrendering to that force, allowing it to guide you rather than trying to control everything around you. That evening, Mel sat alone in his study, the faint light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He had always been a man who thought deeply, who pondered the meaning of things for hours. But tonight something was different. There was a quiet certainty in his heart that hadn't been there before. He picked up a journal from his desk and began to write. It wasn't something he often did, but for some reason, tonight it felt right. The words came slowly at first, but then more freely. He wrote about the doubts he had carried for so long, the guilt that had weighed him down, and the idea of faith as a journey, not a destination. He wrote about the importance of grace, both giving it to others and receiving it for himself. As the ink flowed onto the paper, he felt a sense of release, as if he were finally letting go of the burden he had been carrying for so many years. In his writing, Mel acknowledged his mistakes, his regrets, and the moments where he had faltered. But he also recognized that those moments did not define him. He was not his failures. He was a work in progress, just like everyone else. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to keep moving forward, with humility, with kindness, and with the belief that redemption was always within reach. It was a simple revelation, but one that had eluded him for much of his life. He realized for the first time in years that he didn't have to keep punishing himself for the past. He could choose to live differently, to live with intention, with love, and with faith. Later that night, as Mel sat in the quiet of his home, he thought about the conversation he had with Keanu once again. There was something about Keanu's ability to speak with such honesty and humility that made it easy for others to open up as well. Mel found himself wishing that more people could experience the kind of peace Keanu had found. It wasn't about religion or doctrine. It was about understanding that love, forgiveness, and faith were things that everyone deserved, no matter their past. The next day, Mel found himself in a meeting with a group of people from his production company. The topic of the meeting was focused on a new project they were planning. But for the first time in a long while, Mel wasn't consumed by the details. He was present, listening, thinking about the things that truly mattered. He had never been one to speak openly about his faith, especially in the public eye, but something in him felt compelled to share. As the meeting went on, he found himself speaking about the importance of trust, of moving through life with love, and of learning to accept imperfections. "None of us are perfect," Mel said, looking around the table at his colleagues. "But that doesn't mean we're not worth something. We can all make mistakes, but we can also choose to grow, to learn, and to forgive." There was a brief silence in the room before one of his colleagues spoke up. "You know, Mel, I've always admired how you've kept going, even when things weren't easy. I think that's a kind of strength that not everyone has." Mel smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't just about the words he had spoken. It was the truth behind them. He had finally come to a place where he no longer felt the need to hide behind the walls of his past. He could be vulnerable and still stand tall. As the meeting wrapped up, Mel found himself walking out into the crisp air of the evening. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it felt like a new beginning. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace about the path he was on. Back at his home, Keanu sat once again by the window, watching the world go by. He had no grand plans or expectations for what would come next. But he knew one thing for certain: the quiet moments of connection he had with people, whether in a simple conversation or in a shared look, were what truly mattered. Life was full of uncertainty, but there was a beauty in the uncertainty, in the trust that even when things didn't make sense, there was always something good to be found. For both Keanu and Mel, the lessons they had learned in those quiet moments weren't just about faith. They were about accepting the messiness of life, about letting go of the need for control, and about trusting that love and grace would always guide them no matter what. The days drifted by, and both Keanu and Mel felt the weight of the months behind them in different ways. Life had a way of pushing forward, no matter how much time you spent reflecting or looking back. But in that rush of time, they each found moments to pause, moments to reflect on how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Keanu had always been someone who preferred the quiet of solitude, and though his life was far from ordinary, he often sought peace in the simplest things. The sound of the ocean waves, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the way the sky looked at sunset. He was drawn to nature, finding solace in places that didn't require words or explanations. That afternoon, Keanu stood on a small dock, the kind that stretched out into a calm bay, far from the city's noise. The water was still, mirroring the colors of the sky as if it too was taking a deep breath in. He loved this place. It was one of the few spots where he felt at home, not because of the location, but because of the stillness it provided. It reminded him that life wasn't always about moving forward at full speed. Sometimes it was about standing still and letting the world pass by. But as much as Keanu cherished the quiet, he knew the real test of his faith and beliefs was in how he lived when the noise of life could no longer be avoided. He thought about Mel. There was something about Mel's raw honesty that had stayed with him. It had been years since Keanu had felt that kind of vulnerability in another person, and he admired it. It was a reminder that even in the midst of fame and success, there was still room for humility and growth. On a rare day off from work, Keanu found himself back at that cafe, the same one he had walked into months ago. He sat at a corner table, sipping his coffee and watching the world around him. The people walking by, each with their own lives and stories, made him think about the nature of connection. It was easy to get caught up in the pace of things, in the demands of the world. But Keanu believed true connections happened in moments of simplicity. He picked up his phone to scroll through messages when one text caught his attention. It was from Mel. It read, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night. I don't think I've ever really embraced the idea of being okay with who I am, mistakes and all. I'm starting to see that maybe that's what faith is all about. Let's catch up soon." Keanu smiled softly. He hadn't expected a message, but there it was, a sign that Mel was taking the journey seriously, embracing the idea of grace and self-acceptance. Keanu quickly typed a response. "I'm glad to hear that, Mel. Let's meet soon. I think you're on the right path." It felt good to be a part of someone else's growth, even in small ways. Keanu knew that it wasn't about fixing someone's life or offering them all the answers. It was about sharing moments of truth with others and offering support when it was needed. It was about being present in a way that allowed others to feel seen and heard. The next time Keanu and Mel met, it was in a quiet park near Mel's home. The weather was crisp and the leaves crunched underfoot as they walked along the path. It was a peaceful afternoon and neither of them seemed in a rush to say much. Sometimes words weren't necessary. The silence between them was comfortable, as if both of them had reached a place where they no longer needed to fill the air with chatter. After a while, Mel broke the silence. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how faith isn't about being perfect. It's about accepting yourself, flaws and all. It's something I've struggled with for so long. Always feeling like I had to be better before I could accept myself." Keanu nodded, his eyes focused on the trees ahead. "It's easy to get caught up in that. We all want to be something we're not sometimes. But the truth is, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to show up, to try and to give the best of yourself." Mel paused, letting the words settle in. There was something about Keanu's calm demeanor that made it easier to understand. It wasn't about grand gestures or even about doing things for others. It was about living authentically, showing up for yourself as much as you showed up for others. "I've spent so much time running from the parts of myself I don't like," Mel continued, his voice quiet. "I guess I thought that if I could just change the things I didn't like, maybe I'd be more acceptable to people, more lovable. But now I'm starting to see that maybe I don't need to hide all that stuff." Keanu smiled gently. "You're not alone in that. We all carry parts of ourselves that we wish we could change. But it's that very imperfection that makes us who we are. No one is perfect, not even the people we think are. But we're all worthy of love, of forgiveness." Mel thought for a moment, taking in Keanu's words. They sat on a bench by the pond, watching as a few ducks floated by, their movements slow and peaceful. The world around them felt calm, a small reminder that despite the chaos of everyday life, there were always moments of stillness if you took the time to find them. "I've been trying to forgive myself," Mel said after a long pause, "for the mistakes I've made, for the things I've done that I regret. But it's hard. I guess I always thought that if I forgave myself, it meant I was excusing my past." "It's not about excusing anything," Keanu responded, his voice soft but firm. "Forgiveness is about letting go of the burden of guilt. It's about giving yourself the space to move forward, to grow, to change. You don't have to forget what happened, but you can choose not to let it define who you are today." Mel nodded slowly. There was a weight lifting from his shoulders just from hearing those simple words. It wasn't an easy thing to let go of past mistakes, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that holding on to guilt didn't change anything. It didn't make him a better person. It just kept him stuck in a cycle of regret. Keanu didn't speak for a few moments, letting the conversation settle between them. He could see the shift in Mel, the way he was beginning to understand something deeper than words could explain. It was the kind of shift that didn't happen overnight, but rather over time, in small, quiet moments like these. Eventually, Mel looked over at Keanu and smiled, a real smile, one that showed a sense of relief. I think I'm starting to get it. Maybe this whole journey is about letting go of the things that don't serve me. The guilt, the shame, the fear. I don't have to be perfect. I just have to be honest with myself and with others. Keanu returned the smile. Exactly. And it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to try, to learn, and to keep moving forward. They sat in silence for a little while longer, both of them feeling the peace of the moment. The breeze rustled through the trees, and the distant sound of children laughing echoed across the park. Life was simple here, and in that simplicity there was a kind of beauty. As they stood up to leave, Mel turned to Keanu and said, "Thank you. I'm not sure I would have gotten here on my own." Keanu shrugged lightly, his expression warm but humble. "I'm just here to listen. The real work is yours." Mel laughed softly, and the two of them began walking back toward the parking lot. It was the beginning of something new for both of them. They weren't perfect, but they were moving forward one step at a time. As the weeks went by, both Keanu and Mel found themselves navigating through life with a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a simple conversation about faith and self-acceptance had evolved into something more. It was a journey neither of them had expected to take, but one that had brought them closer not just to each other, but to a deeper understanding of themselves. Keanu, for all his success, had always lived with a quiet humility. He didn't chase fame or accolades. He had never needed them. But there was something that had always driven him, a search for meaning, a desire to find peace in the world around him. After his conversation with Mel, something clicked in Keanu's mind. He realized that the small moments in life were often the most meaningful. It wasn't the grand gestures or the big events that left the deepest impressions. It was the quiet, everyday moments, a conversation shared with a friend, a moment of vulnerability, a gesture of kindness. And so Keanu began to live even more intentionally. He spent more time with the people who mattered to him, sharing his thoughts and his quiet reflections. He began to open up more, not in grand declarations but in small, honest conversations. He no longer kept his thoughts and feelings locked away, assuming that silence was the best way to navigate the world. Instead, he spoke about his doubts, his fears, and his journey. And in doing so, he found that others were more willing to open up as well. It wasn't just about faith. It was about being human. Keanu realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It took courage to show the world your true self, flaws and all. And it was in those moments of openness that the most meaningful connections were formed. On the other hand, Mel had undergone a transformation of his own. The process hadn't been easy, but it had been deeply rewarding. Letting go of the past, forgiving himself, and embracing his flaws had given him a new sense of freedom. He no longer felt the need to hide behind the walls of his past mistakes. Instead, he accepted that he was not perfect, but that didn't make him any less worthy of love, compassion, and forgiveness. Mel found himself looking at life differently. He began to see the beauty in the mundane, the little things that often went unnoticed. He appreciated the quiet moments just as much as the loud ones. He learned to embrace the uncertainty of life, knowing that not everything had to be figured out right away. Sometimes the journey was more important than the destination. One evening, after a long day of work, Mel found himself sitting on his porch, watching the sun set. The sky was a brilliant shade of orange, the air cool and still. As he sat there, his mind wandered back to that conversation with Keanu. That night had marked the beginning of a new chapter for him, a chapter that had led him to a place of greater peace and understanding. He thought about all the times he had tried to control every aspect of his life, to make sure everything was perfect. But the truth was, life wasn't perfect. No one's life was perfect, and that was okay. What mattered was how you responded to the imperfections, how you learned to accept yourself and others despite them. Mel realized that, for so long he had been afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of showing the parts of himself that were broken or flawed. But now, he saw vulnerability as a gift, something that allowed him to connect with others on a deeper level. It was through his own imperfections that he could truly empathize with others, and in doing so he found that he didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to be present. That night, as he sat on his porch, Mel decided to send Keanu a message. It had been a while since they'd spoken, but he felt compelled to reach out. He typed a simple message. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation lately. I just wanted to say thank you. I don't think I would have found this peace without your words. I've come to realize that I don't need to be perfect to be enough. And that's a huge relief." Keanu's response came quickly. "I'm glad to hear that, Mel. You don't have to be perfect. None of us do. We're all just figuring it out one step at a time." The words felt like a weight had been lifted off Mel's shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the pressure to be someone he wasn't. He didn't need to have it all figured out. He just needed to keep showing up, doing his best, and trusting that the journey would unfold as it was meant to. Over the following weeks, Keanu and Mel met a few more times, their conversations always grounded in the simple truths they had both discovered. Their friendship had deepened, not because they had shared any grand moments, but because they had been willing to be real with each other. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had formed through shared vulnerability. One afternoon, as they sat together in a park, Mel spoke up. "You know, I never thought I'd get to a place like this. I thought I had to do something drastic, something big to find peace. But it turns out it's the small things that matter the most. The way we treat others, the way we treat ourselves." Keanu nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the idea of needing to do something extraordinary, but in the end, the most meaningful moments are often the quiet ones. The ones that don't make the headlines but change us on the inside." As they sat there watching the world go by, both men knew that their lives had been forever changed by that one conversation. It wasn't about religion or belief in the traditional sense. It was about understanding that life was messy, that none of us were perfect, and that we were all worthy of love and grace, even in our brokenness. Keanu had always been someone who valued simplicity, and in a way his journey had been about returning to that simplicity. It wasn't about seeking answers in the chaos of the world, but finding peace in the stillness. It was about living authentically, being honest with yourself and showing up for others with an open heart. For Mel, the journey had been more challenging, but no less rewarding. He had spent so many years trying to be someone he wasn't, hiding parts of himself out of fear that they would not be accepted. But through his conversations with Keanu, he had come to understand that it was in embracing those parts, the broken, imperfect parts, that he could truly be free. As the days turned into months, both Keanu and Mel found themselves in a better place, a place of understanding and acceptance. They had learned to let go of the need for perfection and had embraced the beauty of imperfection instead. Life wasn't easy, but it was full of possibilities, full of moments that could change everything, if you were willing to see them. And so, as they continued their respective journeys, both men carried with them the lessons they had learned. They didn't need to have all the answers. They just needed to trust the process, embrace their flaws, and keep showing up. After all, that was what made life beautiful, the willingness to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead was uncertain. As they walked down that quiet path, side by side, they knew that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. But they were no longer afraid of what lay ahead. They had found peace, and that was enough.